In March 1954, Admiral Richard Byrd sat down for a television interview that aired exactly one time and was never broadcast again. This is what he said, why it matters, and why the people who should have followed up on it never did. The interview ran on a CBS program called the Longines Chronoscope. It was a 30-minute format. One camera, two chairs. A respected military journalist named William Bradford Huey asking the questions. The full recording reached audiences once, on a Tuesday evening, and then it went into an archive. The transcripts were dispersed across university collections, and for the next 70 years, almost nobody talked about it. To understand why that matters, you first have to understand who Richard Byrd actually was. Not the version most people have seen in a single paragraph of a history textbook, but the full picture. Byrd was one of the most decorated naval officers in American history, a Medal of Honor recipient, a man with direct access to every presidential administration from Wilson through Eisenhower. When the United States Navy needed someone to fly over uncharted territory, they sent Byrd. When the government needed someone to lead a military expedition into a continent that was still 90% unmapped, they sent Byrd. He led 5 separate expeditions to Antarctica between 1928 and 1956. 5. And that number alone raises a question that the official record has never cleanly answered. The standard story about Antarctica is that it is a scientifically interesting but economically irrelevant frozen wasteland. So why was a 4-star admiral being sent there repeatedly across nearly 3 decades? Why was the United States Navy spending the equivalent of billions in modern dollars to deploy icebreakers, submarines, fighter aircraft, and over 4,000 personnel to a continent that was supposedly holding nothing worth finding? The most significant of these missions was Operation High Jump in 1946. World War II had just ended. The military was in the middle of massive budget cuts, and yet the Navy assembled a task force of 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, 2 seaplane tenders, and a submarine with more than 4,700 personnel, and sent them south. The stated purpose was cold weather training. That was the official explanation. What Byrd told a Chilean newspaper called El Mercurio in March of 1947 was something else entirely. In his own words, he said the United States needed to take defensive measures against enemy aircraft that come from the polar regions. Aircraft, he said, that could fly from one pole to the other with incredible speed. Read that again carefully. The man running the largest Antarctic expedition in history was telling a foreign press outlet that there were aircraft operating out of the polar regions in 1947 with capabilities that no nation on Earth was supposed to possess. The standard rebuttal is that he was referencing Soviet bombers or leftover wartime technology. But in 1947, no aircraft in existence had the range or the speed he was describing. The fastest experimental jets of that period could barely approach the sound barrier. Pole-to-pole flight without refueling was not possible for anything flying under any known flag. Operation High Jump was scheduled to last 6 to 8 months. It ended in under 8 weeks. Aircraft were lost. Personnel were lost. The Navy refused to declassify the full operational logs for decades. 7 years after that mission ended, Byrd sat down with Huey for the Chronoscope segment. He was nearing the end of his life. He had already completed another expedition called Operation Deep Freeze in the years between, and on national television, with the camera running, he chose not to talk about his medals or his flights over the South Pole. He chose to talk about what had not yet been found. He told Huey that Antarctica was, in his words, the last great unknown territory on the face of the Earth, larger than the United States and Mexico combined. He said that even after 5 expeditions, humanity had explored less than 10% of its surface. And then he said something that researchers have been quoting, debating, and pulling apart for 70 years. He said there was a land beyond the pole that contained the greatest concentration of natural resources on the planet: coal, iron, minerals of every kind. and he hinted at something more, something that suggested Antarctica had not always been frozen, something that suggested it had once been inhabited. That is not a claim from a conspiracy channel. That is what a four-star admiral said on CBS in 1954. Roughly 12 minutes into the broadcast, Hawaii asked him whether there was anything left on Earth to discover. Byrd paused, he looked down, and then he said, paraphrasing because the exact wording has been contested, that the exploration of the unknown was no longer the privilege of his generation. He said the next great frontier was not on the surface of the earth, but beneath it and beyond it. And then he said this, there are lands yet to be discovered that will rewrite what humanity believes about its own past. Lands that contain the remains of civilizations older than anything in the history books. Lands hidden, he said, by the most efficient defense any secret could ask for. Ice and cold, and the indifference of a public told there is nothing there to find. After that, he went back to talking about his medals. That pause between what he said and what he stopped himself from saying is where the entire mystery lives. For context on why those words carry weight, consider two maps that came to public attention in 1959, just 5 years after that interview and 4 years after Byrd's death. The Piri Reis map was drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral who claimed in writing that he had copied it from older source maps already ancient in his time, some of them tracing back to the era of Alexander the Great. The Orontius Finaeus map was drawn in 1531 by a French cartographer working from charts preserved in monasteries and private collections across Europe. Both maps depict the coastline of Antarctica in detail. Both were produced centuries before Antarctica was officially discovered, and both appear to show the continent in an ice-free condition, with rivers, mountain ranges, and coastal features that modern ice-penetrating radar has since confirmed exist beneath the frozen surface today. The United States Air Force Cartography Division examined the Piri Reis map in 1960 and concluded that the geological features depicted were accurate. These were not forgeries, and if they were not forgeries, then someone mapped Antarctica before it was covered in ice. Mainstream geology places Antarctica's freezing at somewhere between 20 and 30 million years ago, long before humans, long before anything resembling civilization. There are only two conclusions available. Either the ice came far more recently than the official timeline allows, within the span of human history, or there was a civilization on this planet that mapped Antarctica while it was still ice-free, and that civilization left no trace in the history books we were given. Byrd, standing on the ice, flying over the interior, was not speaking about maps. He was speaking about what he had personally seen. In 1929, during his first Antarctic expedition, Byrd narrated over newsreel footage of his aircraft crossing the polar plateau. In that narration, recorded for public audiences, he described mountain ranges that should not have been there. He described dark patches in the ice that, when investigated, turned out to be exposed rock formations with what he called peculiar geometric regularity. He did not use the word ruins, he did not say civilization, but he described rock that looked shaped, rock that looked carved, rock that looked like the remains of something built. That footage exists. Sections of it survive in archived newsreels, though most versions available today have been heavily edited. The full audio tracks were never digitized by major archives. The original reels are held at Ohio State University, which houses the bulk of the Byrd archive. Researchers who request access to the unedited audio are told the reels are temporarily unavailable due to conservation or transit. This has been the reported situation for decades. The journalist who conducted the 1954 interview was not simply looking for a retirement profile. Hawaii had covered the Emmett Till case. He had a reputation for drawing out on camera what his subjects would not say elsewhere. According to a letter he wrote to a colleague that surfaced in a private collection in the 1990s, Hawaii believed Byrd was sitting on the biggest story of the 20th century. He believed Byrd knew things about Antarctica, the polar regions, and ancient history that no other living person knew. He wanted it on tape before Byrd was gone. The interview. Ed. The reviews noted his reflective tone and dignified presentation. Not one mainstream outlet pulled the quote about civilizations older than the history books. Not one followed up on what he said about lands yet to be discovered. The interview ended, went into the archive, and was never broadcast again. In November of 1956, Byrd led his fifth and final expedition south, Operation Deep Freeze. He returned in early 1957, exhausted and ill. On March 11th of that year, he died in his sleep at his home in Boston. He was 68 years old. The official cause was a heart condition that had been worsening for years. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, attended by senators, generals, and 3 former presidents. And then, almost immediately, something happened to his name in public memory. Newspapers that had tracked his every move for 30 years stopped mentioning him. Schools that had used his expeditions in geography curricula quietly revised their materials. Networks moved his footage into deep storage. By the mid-1960s, he was no longer a household name. By the 1970s, he was a footnote. The man who had run the most ambitious polar exploration program in American history was barely referenced in the training of the next generation of Antarctic researchers. The question that matters is not just what happened to Byrd. It is why the erasure was so thorough. You do not quietly remove an American hero from public consciousness without a reason. 2 years after Byrd's death, the Antarctic Treaty of 1959 effectively closed the continent to independent exploration. Only government-sanctioned scientific missions are permitted. Private expeditions are restricted. Tourism is tightly controlled. The continent Byrd called the last great unknown is, in practical terms, the last great forbidden zone. Even today, certain regions of Antarctica remain off-limits to credentialed researchers without explanation. The interior, particularly the areas around the South Pole and the Queen Maud Land region, requires aircraft to file flight plans that route around specific zones. Satellite imagery of those zones is conspicuously low resolution compared to surrounding areas. Whistleblowers who worked at McMurdo Station have reported being told that certain valleys and mountain ranges were simply not to be discussed. In 2017, a team of British researchers using ice-penetrating radar discovered what appeared to be the foundations of a massive structure buried under nearly 2 kilometers of ice in West Antarctica, roughly the size of a small city. The official explanation is that it is a natural geological formation, but the radar returns show angular features that do not match any known natural process. The researchers were not allowed to publish full details. According to one team member who spoke off the record in 2019, the data was classified for review by an international consortium that included representatives from several governments and at least 2 private foundations. It has not been released. That is the world Byrd was pointing toward in 1954, not in dramatic statements, not in declarations, in careful, measured words spoken by a man who had spent 30 years in uniform and knew exactly what he could and could not say. He said there was more. He said the past was older. He said the unknown was greater than the public had been told, and then he paused and went back to his medals. The interview aired once. Byrd died the following year. The footage was archived, the transcript was scattered. The continent he explored remains the most controlled landmass on Earth, but the words survived. And as long as the words survive, so does the question. What did Admiral Byrd see at the bottom of the world? What did the United States government determine had to be classified, suppressed, and gradually forgotten? And what is still down there, under 2 kilometers of ice, that a British research team was not allowed to tell the public about in 2017? The fragments are still surfacing. The door Byrd opened in that single broadcast in 1954, carefully deliberately, in half sentences and meaningful pauses, has never fully closed, and every year more people are walking through it.